Thank you so much, Dr. Belinda, for coming. First of all, I think I wanted to say thank you for making all the way here to our studio to be with us.
You're welcome.
So, before I start, I just want to say, who is Dr. Belinda?
Well, it's an interesting thank you to start with that and start with myself.
Yeah.
So I grew up in, first born in Auburn Hospital, and grew up in Marylands for the first 10 years of my life. And I've always been living or having the privilege to live on Darug country. And we moved to the Blue Mountains when I was a young person, about 10.
Okay.
It's something really interesting about, I was thinking about this before, that not always feeling strangely part of Australia in some sense.
Yeah.
I felt that from a really young age, and I remember reading a study about young people, that there was a study that was done about, what was looking at children's interest or their favourite book when they were, the age of 5, and that would be a determinant of their future course or their career path.
Oh, I need to pay attention to that.
And when I was a child, my favourite book was a book of children dressed in national costume.
Okay.
And I think because I always didn't have a strong sense of belonging here, for lots of reasons, there was always a curiosity for me about the rest of the world. And that continued. I also, as a young person, was very, I suppose, politicised in terms of the time that I grew up. I grew up in the sort of late 70s, 80s, read a lot about Central America and the dangers and harms of American foreign policy, read a lot about Karl Marx, and very interested in communism and Russia and this kind of stuff, which was
the Cold War season.
The Cold War, a child of the Cold War. And so that sort of, I suppose I always had a dream to be a journalist, and always loved writing. So eventually I did do a journalist degree.
Okay, wow.
Yeah.
Wonderful, interesting.
Which I didn't
We'll talk about that.
sort of get to use as readily, but always sort of kept up my writing and did a bit of radio myself.
Okay, brilliant.
And then I discovered anthropology. The other thing about the age and the time I grew up was that it wasn't so necessary as it might be today, where there's a real focus on going to university and getting a vocation. I'm of that generation where it was cool and acceptable to travel before you went to university. And so I did that, when I was about 21. I decided to go to England for 3 months and came back 4.5 years later.
Okay.
And then started university later on in life at 25. And as I said, I started with journalism, but also discovered this anthropology, which seemed to answer a lot of my questions and desire to sort of critically analyse, difference and understand the logic and nuances of culture. And whilst I was overseas during that time, I had the privilege of going to India as a backpacker.
Okay.
And really hated it as a 21-year-old woman, and was determined to understand so many things that I didn't understand. So there was a little bit of an emphasis in my anthropological sort of inquiry around India in particular. And sort of that led on to maybe 20 years of study about the Indian subcontinent.
Wow.
Before sort of, reaching that point of going and doing a PhD in anthropology and going to India to do what's called ethnography, which, like field work
Wow.
in South India, which was a really life-changing privilege. People always ask me, why would you study anthropology in terms of what can you do, what sort of work can you do in that. it's never been a real issue per se. But as I got older, I realised that I wanted to sort of diversify a little bit in my studies and work, and so what I could reconcile with anthropology was doing social work, which happened later on in my life, and so now I guess you could say that I'm also what I call a critical social worker and stroke anthropologist.
Yeah.
So that's a little bit about myself.
Wow.
And where that doctor comes from.
Yeah, yeah. No,
yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much. That's a wonderful journey and a lot of turns here and there, and yeah.
That's what a lot of people say about my life course, which is a real privilege of being able to be a bit eclectic and go off the track a little bit and make a sort of, create
a new
some
path.
Some path in that. But that's a real sort of it's a real honour actually to have been able to do that in my life. Some people, and some young people in particular in the world, are not able to stretch out, as much as I could in terms of studying for so long and studying things that interested me. Yeah.
Absolutely, I think it's important.
That's a massive privilege, I think, of the time that I grew up, and also being, living in Australia.
Yeah. Just curious if Gough Whitlam has to do anything with this.
Actually, I was born the year that Gough Whitlam obtained power.
Okay, obtained power.
And so I think that Gough Whitlam has some presence in the embryo, for sure. Yeah, and also my name, for those that are not aware, Belinda Green was a famous, she was actually Miss World in 1972, and not all people know about that, but that has stayed with me all my life, that people always, the older generation will ask me, are you the famous Belinda Green? And I say, I am a Miss World of sorts. Yeah. I'm an anthropologist, not a model.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Interesting. So now, I know you've been to Ethiopia, and I was just thinking that, what are your memories growing up? And I'm sure you've heard of Ethiopia growing up. What are some of your first impression about Ethiopia? Where did you hear it?
Yeah, I'm glad that you asked me that question, because I felt the need when I was, thinking about having our discussion about qualifying the fact that as a sort of Australian Anglo person to speak about another country is a big ask. And also we all know that there are sort of single stories or representations about parts of the world that aren't always complex enough, aren't always often realistic, and aren't always fair in terms of often those representations mark parts of the world as other or somehow less, and that's very much in that sort of white gaze, I guess, of the world since colonisation. So it's really important to qualify that, that I'm going to see things in a particular way, sadly, because of my upbringing. But also when you talk about Ethiopia, of course, and I'm sure many people from my generation have the same sentiment, what immediately comes to mind, sadly, is famine, drought, and Bob Geldof, Live Aid, raising money, which I hope made it there. But maybe
actually,
not.
We need to take that account.
And seeing imagery, of principally young Ethiopians, and also people that were starving. Yeah.
So that's the impression of it.
Yeah.
And I think that image has crystallized in the mind of the West.
I have to say it's really sad, Daniel, that, now I'm, 49 years old, and I really don't think that I had much more to take with me upon embarking my journey into Ethiopia in 2014, if I'm really honest with myself. Yeah. And I'll talk about that in a minute, about the way that those things can colour and, you know, our perception.
Yeah.
Even when you're there, you know. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very good point, that between that, you know, image hitting the world stage,
yep,
nothing really other strong image has come up to kind of challenge that image from that point on.
That's
at
right.
least till we actually go there, then obviously we'll talk about that. So now you go ahead.
I guess when I started reading, because obviously I wanted
okay.
to read some of the other things that I, you know, again, sort of quite a negative representation through that gaze of the, let's call it the white gaze, you know, or that this idea that Ethiopia was part of the least developed world, whatever that means. It does mean things according to the United Nations and the World Health Organization, and, you know, and yeah, and also this issue of looking at human rights as well. So that was some of the information that I was able to, you know, couldn't sort of get past that on page 10 of Google around Ethiopia before I left, and reading about some of that as well. Yeah. So I think that's a extension of some of that idea of representation of a place of poverty and, you know, hardship. For people, which it's so much more.
Yeah, I think that's
so
right. And I think you've mentioned about the danger of a single story, or the danger of a narrow story.
Which is not my idea. It's we have to sort of own that comes from is it a Nigerian writer?
Yes.
Her name. We have to find yes, but that's right. So that's her idea, and it's a very important idea for people to understand about representation. That can even happen, as I said, when you're there, even as a tourist per se.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a very important one. I mean, it's very natural for human not to be interested in good news stuff. I mean, news is always about disaster, danger, fear. That's the main story that people automatically take on. So there are many other stories, but those stories seems to be the one that sells much.
Yep.
All right. So now, so how did, I know there's an opportunity that came up for you to go and do some work in Ethiopia. First of all, how did the opportunity come about?
Yeah, so it's sort of by chance in a way that I was, you know, I'd been working quite hard for a number of years and wanted to sort of do something maybe a bit different and also go overseas. But now time has moved on. I have a mortgage, I have responsibilities, so how could I go overseas and do something, as well as having a few more skills, you know, what could I do to do that? So I'd also always had, you know, this, I guess it's a bit like, you know, being the backpacker, this idea of going and doing voluntary work overseas always was something, maybe it's part of my generation as well, appealed to me. And so I started sort of looking at, you know, the Australian Volunteers for International Development Program, which once upon a time I believe was part of AusAid, but now that has been dissolved as a department and now is part of the Foreign Affairs and Trade Department. And there are a couple of organisations that were contracted by the government to facilitate, you know, that process for people and advertise positions overseas. I knew that my work would not let me go for, usually a lot of those positions are like 12 to 18 months. So I knew that in terms of my finances and responsibilities that I wouldn't be able to go for such a long duration. so I saw this position, and also I'm not, it's not like I have a whole array of skills for any, that. So I was looking through, and I noticed that there was a placement for 3 months, and it was for a person to go and train a department, Centre for Development Studies at Addis Ababa University, in qualitative research and supporting curriculum development in that. And given that I had, my background and had a fairly strong understanding of qualitative research.
As an anthropologist?
As an anthropologist, yep. And that, I thought, wow, I'll go for it. The other thing that was exciting was that was a really exciting moment, and I feel extremely honoured again, because it was that time where Kevin Rudd and the respective government actually went into the Horn of Africa for the first time in Australia's history around development initiatives.
Oh, okay.
So they started to advertise roles within Ethiopia, Kenya. And so I was one of those sort of few people, because they sadly pulled it very quickly away.
Any reason why they pulled it back?
Well, look, at that time as well, I know that when I sort of, I went for an interview, I got the placement, and then, we went to our orientation in Melbourne with a whole group of people that were going to many parts of the world, and there are a couple of people that were intending to go to Kenya, alongside myself in that particular cohort of people. And it's that time where there was the attacks in Nairobi.
Oh, yes.
By Al-Shabaab.
Yeah.
And so what happened was that those people, their placements were pulled. One person went with me to Ethiopia as an alternative. As an alternative placement. But just, I don't have an explanation. I wish we could talk to Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard about why they pulled that initiative. But there was a lot of, like when you go on DFAT, Department of Foreign Affairs, when you look at their profile, of different countries, and there was a lot of concern, around security. And I don't know, I'm making that up, but if that had any role to play.
I mean, the interesting about security, and also, and I think there was one moment where Boka was at University of New South Wales coming to talk about diplomacy workshop and that kind of thing. And I was there and I had a chat with him, and I said, what would be Australia's interest in Africa? And he said mining. And one of that's a big interest is in mining.
Okay, yep.
Because Australia's a big mining companies, and so there are maybe 200 different companies of mining there in Australia. So
within the continent.
Within the continent, yeah. So that means there's a strong interest in Africa in general.
Yeah. And
I think Ethiopia being the, AU, the African Union headquarter. Patricia Garcia, the person I interviewed previously as well, was a person who's advocating that Australia should have an embassy there. And I think we did have an embassy, but I don't know if it is still operating now.
Yeah, I know I did very briefly visit the consulate when I was there in Addis, and met, would I call her the ambassador or commissioner of that? But yeah, that's a good question, and that's an interesting perspective.
I mean, if you've got an African Union there, it's a place of diplomacy, and if you've got all sort of things going on in Africa, that's a place to be. I think maybe that's a call to the Australian government to have a strong presence there.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. All right. So now.
So yeah, I mean, there was only, I think, not even 10 people, 10 Australians that eventually, engaged in that program, and there were, from my understanding, two groups or two cohorts. Okay. Me being the second, that went. Yeah. So, a massive privilege, you know, in terms of, being able to go there.
So initially, what drew you to that opportunity? The fact that it was short term, 3 months. But I'm sure all the other places are short term as well.
No, like a lot of them were.
A lot of long term.
And also just that thing that can happen for me, and this is what takes me off onto different pathways, being what I hope, to the best of my ability, a critical thinker, realising that, you know, I don't really know much about the Horn of Africa. And from previous experiences of living overseas, the only way that I'm going to know is if I have the opportunity to somehow live there and do something there, not just travel there. Because travelling and tourism is a different thing. You can definitely, and also the challenge to go somewhere on your own is, I mean, I would encourage it in the sense of not really taking anything with you to stay.
Just your credit card.
To stay in your culture, in your cultural lens. To, you know, to have that discomfort more readily. I sound a bit sort of sadistic, but if you're really going to have some experience so they were some of the factors that I need to go, you know, and learn. This is a whole part of the world that we know very little about, you know. So that's a really, I mean, that some people like to jump out of an aeroplane. For me, like going, you know, to somewhere and doing that is really,
So that's what the anthropologists call the immersive learning, where you kind of immerse yourself into the culture.
Try to, but of course being
drawing back and then reflecting on it as well.
Yeah, and often you can learn, you know, in that space of being, you know, you learn about yourself as well, and you learn about your own culture in terms of what happens to you, what you react to.
Yeah.
But I also know and have to say, you know, that, but, you know, being a white person, that, you know, there was a lot of safety for me to do that. I think that needs to be said, that and that, you know, it was really very carefully facilitated by the Australian government and by the people that were assigned to look after us there, and versus what that might be like, you know, for people, perhaps, you know, a different experience. Like sometimes I feel, you know, as a white person, you can be safer, ironically, disturbingly, maybe, you know, obviously, in terms of the world order stuff and power relations than people that live there. So I don't. Why I'm saying that is I don't want to position myself as this great risk taker who, you know, just pack my bag and, you know, I'm super adventurous. Like there's also, sort of.
Big brothers looking after you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, you know, I felt that in terms of the way that I was treated as a Ferengi, you know, and as a doctor and, you know, going to the university, that there was a certain level of privilege that I automatically had arriving, you know, to an unknown place and being solitary. Yeah. So.
I mean, it's. I guess the strength of a nation is measured by how its citizens are protected, looked after, not just only within the nation, but when they go abroad. Almost everyone knows where I grew up, if someone has an American passport, or that's big.
Yep.
Can't taste that. Where does that thinking come from? That came from because the image that we've seen of the power that protects their own citizen. Yep. Even when there's tons of war, there are in the media, there's 2 American citizens missing, all things that, you know, all sort of people dying. Those 2 citizens they need to be looked after. So, and I guess I mean, it's funny. This under Zoe Media, this show is actually called Imago Dei, which means image of God. It's a Latin word for image of God, which is that everyone is made in the image of God, so they all have equal inherent dignity, regardless of what their passport says. So, absolutely, I agree with you that it's important that since they have equal inherent dignity, how do we make sure that all other lives are protected as well in times of danger, not just the 2 citizens or the 3 citizens from Australia. But at the same time, Australia has that legal responsibility to make sure that they look after their citizen wherever they are, because that's their job.
Yeah.
All the other countries might not have that resources to do so.
Exactly.
Or sometimes they might just not have the moral stand to do it as well.
Because or the power positionality in terms of the global world order as well, in terms of their capacity to lobby or to resist or to, you know, that sort of something, and who their allies are and who their allies are, you know, who they're not, who they're aligned with, you know, that sort of...
Absolutely, and I agree, and it is, and one of the things I think we've seen during the changeover in the government is that was number of people who are locked up, Ethiopians locked up in Kenya, in Tanzania, and all that kind of thing, going to Saudi Arabia, being released because the government has been lobbying, saying that, you know, those are my citizens. If they've committed a crime, take them to court. Otherwise, you can't just have them there. So there's a number of them that have been released, which brought that sense of pride into the people. That's like, well, you know, we've been looked after. And there will be times where something happens and the government says, well, we'll wait and investigate really if they are our citizens or not. And then people get disheartened about that. So, I think even if you don't have the resources, even coming out and making a statement and saying that we'll do all we can, it gives that sense of hope to people. But if you say nothing, or at times you say, wait a minute, we will investigate if they are one or not, where people are hurting. So I agree with you. Resource is one thing, power to lobby is another thing, and also just making the right decision and just voicing and advocating. That doesn't require a lot of resources. It also need to be,
provided you're not sort of annoying or jarring those, you know, things that are going on behind the scenes in terms of trade relations. I mean, that all comes into play around when and how governments speak, you know, as well.
That's true.
Because I believe, I mean, in terms of your, you know, title, that, the importance of everyone having that right to dignity. That's really important to me.
Yeah.
Regardless of what passport they have or where they live in the world. Yeah,
absolutely. All right. So now, how did you get interested? I know you say that it was a short term. That's one tick on, like short term. Excellent. Is there anything else that really got you interested? Obviously, you say that you know nothing about that area, so you draw curiosity. Is there anything else that drew you to that place?
Just about the wanting to know, wanting to see, you know, and have, because it's you know, I mean, I know that it's an ancient part of the world. I'm suspicious in my critical thinking that why is it so limited in what we know about it? Surely this can't be
all there is to learn.
All there is to know. Yeah. Given it's sort of, and also as an anthropologist, the complexity or potential, I didn't know exactly what that meant, but the complexity of people and culture was something as well that interested me, of course. So it's and it's just an honour to go to a part of the world that DFAT say don't go to, and you know, and to have that opportunity. It's, I mean, I sort of feel that's partly what we're here to do, is to expose ourselves to, if we can. It's a privilege. So
Absolutely.